Paleo to Pioneer presents Small Batch Science, Episode 4.
Hi, I'm Andy, and today we're going to talk about some things we know that mastodons ate about 14,500 years ago. And in this case, they all came from an archaeological site in the Aucilla River called Ladson. They were excavated by a number of different teams over the years, starting in the late 80s up through even about 5 years ago. My professor and one of my colleagues helped produce a book called First Floridians and Last Mastodons, and I'm using the species list from a wonderful chapter on the Mastodon digesta by Lee Newsom and Matt Milbachler. They found 61 species of plants tucked inside of the deposits around the bones and some artifacts dating to that period. And digesta is kind of the polite word for saying we're not quite certain if this was the material that was still in the stomach contents of this mastodon when it was killed and being butchered by these early people, or if in fact the material had already been left there by the mastodons. You might have come to this point and said, but how do you know it was a mastodon and not a mammoth? Well, that's a good question, and I'll tell you. This is a cast, a 2/3 size cast of a mammoth molar, and so the real one's obviously noticeably bigger, but the important point is the grinding surface. The occlusional surface here is a bunch of plates that are pretty nice and flat, and mammoths are more in the grazing end of things, grass eaters, and less browse comparatively to the mastodons. So mammoths grind things up not unlike what my hands do when my knuckles rub together. And so pieces of twigs, grass, all the fiber just basically gets shredded, and the pieces are really not all that identifiable if you were to find them. Mastodons, on the other hand, have much higher crowns and are more in the browsing end of things, and when they occlude, or when they chew, their teeth come down and chop things into little 2-inch bits or so, and that's exactly what we found. Lots and lots and lots of twigs, most of that kind of unidentifiable, but tucked within there were the seeds and bark and little bits of things that were readily identifiable. Of the 61 species mentioned in here, about 15 of them are interesting to us today, and I'll run through a couple of those. Maybe 3 of them are medicinals, including a different species of ilex or holly, some willow, and another thing. The real fun part, though, is when we get to the dozen or so that are edibles, that humans eat even today. They include things like amaranth, which is something you can get as a cereal in the health food section of pretty much any grocery store these days. Blackberry, what else? Hawthorn, persimmon, wild plum, crab apples, hickory. There's also acorns, which we don't eat today really, but prehistorically lots and lots of people processed them to get rid of the tannins and would then make flour or cakes out of them and eat them as well. It turns out that the intergalactic headquarters of Paleo to Pioneer is located at Firefly Farm. And we grow 2 of the most interesting of the species recovered in the Mastodon dung. And in fact, they were first found at Ladson, dating to 14,500 years ago, and then not long after that, back in '95, we actually found both of them again with more Mastodon digesta at a site dating greater than 34,000 years ago, which means these plants have been in Florida a lot longer than we ever thought before, and we'll focus on those in just a moment. So what you're looking at here in the bag are a grape tendril, a grape seed, Vitis spa, but it's most similar to the modern muscadine. It's sort of a primitive, undomesticated version of it. And inside the air bubble you're looking at a Cucurbita pepo seed, one of the big squash seeds. And again, these are actual specimens recovered from a pile of discarded digesta that date to 14,500 years ago. That's actually how old they are. I seriously doubt we could get them to sprout, but we're really pleased to be able to show you real ones. I don't know why it really just struck me during the pause, but one of the most interesting aspects of the field research was that while sitting on the screen as people were excavating 30 feet below us, you could smell exactly what you were working in. There was no doubt about it, and when we finally had figured out what all those little twigs meant, it was really kind of an epiphany. It's really been a really wonderful part of the research. And so these are some grapes from here that I just picked. Nice muscadines. Everybody knows muscadines. They make wonderful white grape juice and other things that are very closely related to grape juice. The cucurbitas are really interesting because it had long been thought, published for 100 years plus, maybe closer to 200 years before this work discovered these things this old. It was thought that Cucurbita pepo was brought into North America from from Mexico and Central America sometime after probably 4,500 years ago. You're looking at some of the evidence that directly shows that that is not the case, that in fact that particular kind of squash that now the most common we'll see here are these Seminole pumpkins, which is just one of the two kinds that are around these days still. They are not introduced, they are native. And you'd be surprised how many people, even 10, 20 years after this work has been published and been out there and known, just don't realize that Cucurbita pepo is native to the United States and the Southeast. And in fact has been here, and we can document it for now, in excess of right around 35,000 years. But in this case, a very particularly interesting one because it's on the landscape with a mastodon that people had predated, suggesting perhaps that all these plants and foodstuffs were available to them, and that in point of fact we eat a lot of the same things that mastodons did. Thanks for tuning in, and please check out the website at www.paleontopioneer.com, and we'll be back with more small batch science soon.